Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Waking Up Naked in Strange Places by Julie McGalliard. So I bought this book because of a tour. So one of my guests on one of my tours one night was an author, and we were talking about fantasy, and she told me she had written a series of books about a Cajun-inspired werewolf. And that the first book was called Waking Up Naked in Strange Places. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a book for me. So the moment I got home, I ordered it. I had high plans that I was going to read it immediately and write a review, and I was thinking that, oh, maybe she'll see the review and appreciate it and share my reviews with other people, and maybe, just maybe, my review will help her sell more books so we can be sort of vaguely friendsies, you know, just general trying to network a little bit. But then, while I was waiting for the book to arrive, I panicked, because this is me. And there's nothing in the world that's too stupid for me to panic over. Because I kept thinking about those books that you see in gift shops. You know, the ones that are clearly cheap cash grabs to, you know, make money off of a place's vibes or lore. And I own several of those books, or have read them in the past, and just in general, they tend to be subpar as books. And even ignoring that particular trope in books, there's also just the fact that I don't like every book out there. I don't even like every good book out there. There have been plenty of books that I've read and have acknowledged were good and did not like. And then I started to worry, what if this book comes in and I read it and I hate it? Like, my goal has been to do a review of every single book I read, no matter what. And like, mostly that hasn't bothered me. Like, if I don't like a book and I write a slightly negative review, who cares? I have an astronomically tinier audience than most of the books I'm reading. Like, objectively, some of my reviews have a total of 3 viewers. So it's not like it's that big of a deal if I dislike a book. I'm not hurting anyone's sales, and the chances of the author seeing are so slim that it's not like there's a chance of me hurting their feeling. But this was different, because I met the author. She was nice to me. She came on my tour. She gave me a tip. She was a good human being. And then I started thinking about, like, what if I read their book, dislike it, write a negative review, and she sees it? I would be such an asshole. And then after panicking about this endlessly, I got the book and read it and realized that all that worry was unnecessary. I liked this book. So, Waking Up Naked in Strange Places is the story of a girl named Self-Abnegation, who has grown up in an ultra-religious family who live in an old campground in the swamps around New Orleans. And after years of abuse, she decides that she has had enough and runs away. Luckily, almost immediately being picked up by an incredibly nice woman named Steph, who is herself moving cross-country to escape her abusive ex-husband. Steph agrees to take Abnegation, who she immediately nicknames Abby, so I will be referring to her as Abby throughout the rest of the review, to Seattle with her. Abby will get a place to stay and a chance at a new, normal life, and Steph will get someone to help her take care of the baby she's currently pregnant with. But the promised normal life does not turn out that normal for Abby. Partially because Steph's abusive ex has followed them, desperate to get his hands on his son. And partially because Abby suddenly finds herself waking up naked in strange places. Pretty soon, she sort of has to acknowledge she's a werewolf. So I already gave away the fact that I like this book. I found Abby to be a really fascinating character. I love the world the author created here, which was populated with mostly good, kind, loving people, to counterbalance the absolutely terrible people who are the antagonists. I like how much of this book was about Abby coming to understand herself and the world around her. And not just in the normal coming-of-age kind of style. Like, a lot of coming-of-age books, you see the character come into themselves through their actions, and basically just seeing how much they can take and what kind of hero they will be. And that is here too. But a lot more of this book is inside Abby's head. And this book is in first-person point of view, and it's a very close, tight first-person point of view. We are directly in Abby's thoughts most of the time. And that is something that honestly sometimes annoys me. I don't tend to like first-person point of view in books. It feels really unnatural to me, like you're listening to someone who's trying to tell you a story and they're just super oversharing. And in the beginning, I definitely got those vibes a bit, but strangely, it sort of faded away. And I think a large of it was because we were getting so much of Abby's thoughts that it sort of transcended that awkward listening to someone talk about their life stage and got into feeling like a window in someone else's mind. And it also helped that Abby sort of is multiple people in this book. Because she sees the wolf as literally part of herself, but also not part of herself. Like the sections where she is the wolf, it's referred to as she is doing this, so it's sort of a switch of perspective, even though it's sort of not. But also because a lot of this book is about Abby building a personality outside of the extreme depersonalization and dehumanization that she was raised in. So yeah, I will say this is the part of the book that really took me by surprise. Like, I was expecting a werewolf book, and objectively, this is a book about a girl escaping a cult, and she happens to be a werewolf. And I love this. This allowed for a book that was very much an outsider story from the perspective of someone who grew up in our society, who is technically part of it. And like, I'm used to a lot of outsider books. I'm reading a lot of fantasy, you'll see a lot of them, but they tend to be outsiders from a different country, or a different time period, or a different world. Or they're just people who feel like they're outsiders because they're weird, or gothy, or have some strange power. But this book features someone who is an outsider in our country that is recognizably ours, but she's still born in it and outside of it. It's a great combination. And I'm not sure the book always 100% nails this. There is one moment pretty far along where Abby is surprised by a dishwasher in a person's home, and it felt a little bit like that moment should have come like 100 pages earlier. But overall, I really liked the sharp contrast of this person who fits inside of our world and yet is constantly surprised and confused by it. And I was about to say, I cannot really tell whether or not that's authentic, like whether Abby really is what you would expect to see in someone who grew up out in our society, but isolated from it, and is suddenly thrust into the rest of the world. But I sort of can judge that. So I have a friend whose father was a bit of an extreme survivalist. She grew up homeschooled. They built their house on their land in the middle of nowhere. She spent a lot of time attending classes run by her father and his friends about surviving in nature, and just generally did not participate in a lot of the rest of the world. Now, she was never as isolated as Abby. She did theater with kids from the public school. She attended I know she did some martial arts classes, and I feel like some of them were with the general public. And, like, they never lived like the Amish. But also importantly, her father is a bit weird, but he was not an abusive religious zealot. But the thing about it is, a lot of Abby reminded me of my friend. Like Abby, my friend knows how to live in society, but she's often a bit at a loss when it comes to what most of our generation would consider normal pop cultural things. And she honestly doesn't show a huge amount of interest in pop culture. Like Abby, she tends to be very straightforward and unapologetic about not knowing certain things. And like Abby, she learns very quickly when she thinks something is important, but is very prone to dismissing things out of hand that she doesn't see the importance of. And like Abby, she tends to give off this aura of not caring much about the societal order around her. So yeah, I will say that I think the author got a lot right about Abby. And I love the fact that Abby, as she settles into the world outside of her home, we get to see more of the weirdness of the wolf. So in the beginning, it's very much about Abby being this outsider who is an insider and isolated and coming out of that isolation and learning about the world. And right when she starts to settle into the world is right when we start to see the oddness in her wolf. And it felt really right and really resonant to the way that trauma shows itself. A lot of the time, at least what I've read and seen videos and seen movies about, people report seeming really fine up until the moment that their life returns to normal. And that's when they start to really see what trauma has done to them. And yeah, the werewolf very much does stand in as a metaphor for trauma here. And that's part of the reason I was really willing to hand wave away a moment that otherwise wouldn't have quite worked. So, spoiler alert here, Steph accepts the fact that Abby at least believes herself to be a werewolf far more quickly than is logical. And it felt like, at least to me, that what was happening here was that it wasn't that Steph magically believed in magic immediately, which is something that often happens in fantasy books. It felt a lot more like Steph was willing to pretend to believe because she was assuming that Abby was expressing her trauma in whatever way she could. And it seems that was by calling herself a werewolf. And it really worked to get us to the place that we needed to be logically in the story without having to sacrifice that verisimilitude of people just instantaneously believing in magic. But that brings me to one of the only real big problems I see with this book. It felt rushed. Specifically, conversations felt like they were missing a lot of the connective tissue. This is something I see in my own work when I get overexcited with the editing pen. So like quite often I'm trying to get down to a specific word count, and I tend to write too many words in books. So anything that's not 100% necessary gets struck through. And sometimes I'll go back and read a conversation and go, okay, so I know how they got from point A to point B, but that is not how people talk. Like, people in these conversations understand each immediately, even if the idea is not very thoroughly expressed. Everyone allows the topics to switch instantly with no organic pushback or feelings of like, are we done with the previous conversation? There's often just that ever so lack of steps between, so it feels like everyone, instead of going up each individual step, is jumping from like a step down here up to a step up here. And that's what a lot of the conversations in this book felt like, especially in the early chapters when we're just getting to know the characters. An example. Steph goes from almost hitting Abby with her car to agreeing to take her cross country in like less than 3 pages. With no written in time jumps. Like, there's no moment where it said like, and then they talk for an hour. No, we just see their conversation, and this conversation does not include any discussion about the fact that Abby is underage and therefore Steph taking her cross country could get her arrested for kidnapping. Steph takes Abby's word instantly about the fact that Abby really does need to get away and is not just a rebellious teenager and has nowhere else to go. And on the other side of that, Abby immediately trusts Steph without any question about like what this woman is planning. It just all works. And believe it or not, I'm still mostly good with that. Like, there are those moments where characters are thrust together, they have no other options, and they just click with each other. Or they're just in a high-stress moment and they click with each other. And both characters do sort of need someone in that moment. So it sort of makes sense for them to click together that quickly. But I just felt like we needed a hair more. Even one of those time skips where we just see written on the page, they talk for a few hours. We just needed something more. And that is far from the only moment in the book where it feels like there's a bit missing. About half of the conversations in the book felt like there was just some little bit, 1 or 2 lines maybe, that was cut out. And the climax, honestly felt like it was missing about a chapter. There's a lot of false almost resolutions in the climax. Those moments where it's like, oh, everything's resolved, and then, oh no, there's something else going on over there, and then everything's resolved, and oh no, there's something else going on over there. And that can work, but you need enough time to settle into the resolution and enough action after that to make it feel like something's really happening. And it just felt a little bit too quick. There's also the simple fact of the cops were managed way too easily in this book. Like, I'm sorry, but yes, Abby would be going to the police station, and honestly probably to protective services after that, and everyone would be talking to judges. It would not just be Steph saying, no, she's coming with me instead. But, I mean, that's actually sort of a common trope in werewolf books. Like, I think every book that I've ever read that features a werewolf has at least one moment where the cops are 100% more easily managed than they are in real life. But in contrast to all these bits that feel like they were missing something, there were moments of absolute fabulous writing in this book. There's some beautiful turns of phrase that seem to come out of nowhere. There were moments of real communication where people really talked to each other and didn't feel like the classic, oh, this is the formula conversation and contrast in every single, like, teen drama section. There's this one moment where there's a girl that has been being mean to Abby for seemingly no reason. And suddenly, out of the blue, she comes up and explains to Abby what's going on and that it's a her thing, not an Abby thing. And it felt really authentic to me. Like, sometimes those moments really are that out of the blue. Like, someone has been thinking about this for weeks and feeling guilty about it, and they finally resolved, I've got to go explain what's happening. And the girl gives us just enough information that both we as a reader and Abby understand what's going on, and then she moves on. I fucking loved it. There's also a moment where Abby's having trouble with an otherwise likable, nice character failing to understand consent. And both this character and other characters address this. And it sounded so much like the teenagers I used to teach. Like, one thing that I feel like a lot of people have not yet grasped about Generation Z, something that I don't see in a lot of media about teenagers, is Gen Z is really almost surprisingly willing to address uncomfortable things in a very straightforward manner. Like, I don't think I could possibly imagine as a teenager having one of my friends come up to me and being like, hey, just so you know, James misunderstood what you said in class and thinks you were being mean to him, so you should probably go tell him you didn't mean anything by it. Without that being like, you know, a passive-aggressive way of starting a fight. But teenagers nowadays do that. Teenagers nowadays will sit down with their friends and be like, hey, just so you know, you looked like an asshole in that moment. You said something that was cruel. You should not say that word anymore. You should not kiss someone without their permission. Teenagers nowadays are willing to address these things. And that is in this book. And it made me very happy to see, and it felt really authentic to me. But overall, I just really liked the book. I actually am thinking about it a couple days after having read it and was driving to work thinking about, oh yeah, that moment in that great like TV show. No, that was the book I just read. But I especially want to see more from the book, and I want to see a lot more specifically of both Abby and Steph have trauma that is definitely acknowledged in this book, but not dealt with. And I do want to see more of them dealing with that. And I'm in luck because there are 3 more books in this series, and I'm guessing that that gets dealt with a bit more in some of the other books. But I also just love the fact that there's a lot of Cajun flair in this book that doesn't feel like just set dressing. Abby's not just a werewolf, she's a rougarou. And it's clear that the author has done at least enough research to know vaguely what she's talking about, and to make it feel like something that is integrated into the book and not just like, oh, I wanted to make it seem like a cool, out-of-the-way, known but unknown place. I'll put it in New Orleans. This did not feel like the kind of book that you pick up at a souvenir shop in New Orleans. It felt like everything was very much part of the story. And also, I will admit, you don't see a lot of rougarou books, so it was super fun. But overall, I really liked this book. In my opinion, it is definitely a book worth reading, even if it does feel a bit rushed at times.